Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Crossing Borders. Today we have Evelien with NEDAP Identifications. Hi, Evelien.
Hi, Stephanie.
So, since you are a European, you're from the Netherlands, you're Dutch, why don't you give an introduction of yourself and NEDAP identification so people understand the depth and how big NEDAP actually is.
Yeah, okay. I'm Evelien O'Sullivan. I work for NEDAP Identification Systems. NEDAP Identification Systems is part of NEDAP NV, which is a Dutch-based company. We celebrated our 91st anniversary this year. And we're split up in different business units, actually. And each business unit has its own approach to market. And the similarities are that NEDAP focuses on technology for life, and we try to make the life of professional people easier in a lot of different aspects. So that could be either on security management or on the retail side for shop owners, or light controls, livestock management. We do staffing solutions, and I'm part of NEDAP Identification Systems. And we try to make life easier of system integrators that work on the security industry and focus on vehicle access. We have a full portfolio of vehicle access products that involve the identification of vehicle to make a system integrator easier to provide vehicle access as part of the total security plan he provides to customers.
And you've been at NEDAP a really long time. I just looked at your profile again on LinkedIn. It looks like you've been there pretty much almost your whole career.
Yeah, that's right. I started straight out of school, and NEDAP is a quite diverse company. We grew a lot at the time, and we started growing internationally. So NEDAP is a company that constantly evolves, where you can actually take different roles, which I've been doing so far.
And what is your role, current role at NEDAP Identification?
Currently, I'm involved in proposition management for two propositions, long-range vehicle identification and our sensor platform for on-street parking. And I've been involved in multiple roles. I started initially for marketing and PR. And then as our business grew, I moved into business development, initially in Western Europe, so involving the UK and Ireland. Then also involving Southern Europe, so Spain and Italy. Then we also expanded to South Africa and Russia, and eventually also to the Asian and the Pacific region. So I've done business development in most of those regions, and I came across all the cultural differences that you can engage also in these regions.
So you're born and raised in the Netherlands. You know, you're Dutch.
Yeah.
And so you've been doing business throughout Europe and, like you said, Asia and South Africa. What are some of the biggest challenges you've seen, like when you first started working outside of the Netherlands?
Yeah, I think if you start working out of your own region, then you experience cultural differences, although they're in Europe minimal, let's say, but there's still a lot of cultural differences. So I did especially the UK and the Irish market, and I realized it's a very informal market where relationships are very important, where things are not so explicit, where Dutch are very known to be very explicit. And especially I learned a lot in the UK, which is not so explicit, and where you have to read between the lines and be a little bit more careful and see what people exactly mean. Also realized that relationships are in these markets also very important, especially also in smaller markets, because people tend to know in the industry each other very well. Mm-hmm. So you need to implement a fair business to make sure you maintain a long-term relationship with your channel partners, actually.
That's absolutely true. What about in South Africa? How different was that from dealing with Europeans?
Yeah, I think in the UK and Ireland I experienced like the informal aspect of business. I realized that in South Africa this is even more important. Also to build the relationships, to get a good understanding. And of course, a lot of people out of South Africa also deal with other African regions. So it's very important to understand the dynamics, especially in this market that they're dealing with, which can be politically, which can be import-wise, which can be regulation-wise, but also security-wise. I think in Europe, it's traditionally a very safe place, actually, due to maybe some aspects the last few years, but we don't experience this a similar way like they do in South Africa. So to understand the dynamics that people live in and how they operate and why they do things is important to understand. Maybe to sell the same systems, but with different aspects also.
So as NEDAP identification was expanding into other regions, like you said, South Africa is very different, much higher security, especially in Johannesburg. Security,
Yeah.
for gates is so much more important than it is, especially in the Nordics where I live. I mean, was there lots of research done to find out about what the requirements would be? Did you find partners? I mean, do you know how that went about?
Yeah, we set up a partnership. So we had in that time integrations with HID, and therefore we got involved with a lot of HID partners. And I think what I learned is also to listen to the people locally, the partners or the distributors, to what they see, and to leave your own thoughts behind for a while, just to see what they do and why they do this, and to understand and create better understanding of what they're doing, and to support them by doing this. I think that's important, because coming from a European market, we don't typically know condominiums. Northern Europe especially, we don't have such condominiums and the facilities that they have and the security levels they have. So it's just open your eyes, leave everything behind, and listen to what the people say and where they apply your products, because sometimes that's different in different countries due to the fact that the country is organized, or the security regulations in these countries.
Exactly, and the regulations. And then, of course, listening to people, you need to look at what your product does. I mean, have you had to make any major changes to your product, make it more secure or higher security for some of the requirements that you've had, even in government, things within Europe?
Not as much on the product level itself, I think more actually on how you position your products, and which verticals are interesting for your products in which markets, and why, and tailor your communication in these countries to this, to make it more appealing to the everyday problems that they're facing in their country, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I know your products very well. I'm not sure how much the audience we're talking to does. But back to going to the different countries, like you said, the Brits do business very different from the Dutch. Do you have any specific examples of like a lesson learned? Because a lot of people think when they come, especially from the US, we'll just start in, United Kingdom, and then from there we'll just springboard into the rest of Europe. And then even in Europe, it's just so diverse, and you have to know the cultures.
Yeah, exactly. I think also technology adoption is very different for different countries in Europe. Some countries tend to be very advanced in technology adoption, some countries less extent. I think the biggest issue I faced actually in the UK was, of course, Dutch are known to be very straightforward, very strict, very explicit, and Brits are typically not. So I remember making my first calls and people saying, yeah, I'll call you back, definitely. I thought, well, that's a definitely. So I'm definitely going to get a call back, which actually means, no, I'm not going to reply back to you, but you just don't know yet. So I'm just trying to be polite. So you keep ringing these people, and after a while you realize, okay, they mean something else by this. So by learning this way, also you learn to read between the lines, and to read, okay, when people are not so interested, or when they're kind of saying yes but mean no, and I think that's very important. You learn over time.
It is. And do you also have that issue internally? Because I know you have people on the ground in all these different regions, um, bringing them into NEDAP. And, it's very Dutch. I've been to your headquarters, and I mean, it is a diverse culture that you have, but it is very Dutch. Just like I'm in Sweden and work for a Swedish company, it's still the Swedish culture. I mean, has there been challenges with that? I mean, I appreciate the Dutch, and we're gonna, when you lay it out on the table and you don't walk away with any questions, or is this what's gonna happen, because you know exactly what's gonna happen, and I appreciate that. But has that had challenges internally also?
Yeah, I think initially we had a lot of Dutch people taking care of overseas market. It changed also slightly by having more local people involved, also having more hands on the ground also in different regions. And we've actually have established also a lot of really long-term relationship with our international colleagues, some over 15 years already. So I think by the time they understand it, they started understanding the Dutch culture, but we grew kind of together in the middle also, to also make it very clear to them what we do, and to find a way between both, and a common culture, which is actually, I think, our NEDAP culture that we share in common. So some of the values of our Dutch culture are incorporated in that, but also some of the international values. So you create together your corporate culture, which is also very nice indeed. And I think also these times in COVID made it a lot easier to communicate, far easier with all the foreign people.
Mhm.
So I think now there's probably more communication than ever. If we look at it from that perspective, and they're actually more involved in ongoing meetings and digital meetings than before. It was more driven on visits, actually.
Yeah, I think we're definitely learning to do business more successfully remotely.
Yeah.
And when we go back to the so-called normal, I think it'll be a new normal. I mean, I don't think we're all going to be jumping on a plane like we used to. Can that be done over a Zoom call? Can we do that over Teams? And especially once you have established relationships, do you actually need to be there all the time? And will trade shows even exist anymore? Who knows?
And there is though a difficult aspect, I think, in countries that the language is very similar. It is easier to do. In countries, I think, more in Southern Europe or Asia, that is a little bit harder because there's a big face-to-face interaction that is normally required, that interprets how messages come across, how people understood it, how they respond to it. And there's a big non-verbal aspect to this communication, I think, especially in those countries where the language is slightly different and people are not fluent English, perhaps.
You're right. I completely agree with you on that, because in the southern part of Europe, not as many people speak fluent English as they do in the northern part, especially in the Nordics and the Netherlands and Germany. Most people do speak fluent English, especially in the business world. But I have been to meetings in Italy where there were people in the room who didn't speak or understand any English, and it was amazing that they're trying to do international business.
Yeah, and I think also we try to learned also we try to make perfect sentences and really elaborated language, and especially in these regions, it needs to be quite short and brief and clear to interpret. And therefore, if you use a lot of extensive English language, it doesn't really work in translation and often gets lost in translation. So if you want your message to come across, it's easier to communicate in very shorter, clearer language, and to leave a lot of room for interpretation and interaction also to see how does this land, or how is this message perceived by the other party.
I definitely agree with that too. And the other thing is using Google Translate. It's great on a personal level, but if you use straight Google Translate, it doesn't always come across correctly.
No, that's right. That's right. You can end up in very funny situations.
Yeah. An example I have is when I get a note from the post office, Post Nord, to come pick up a package. If I do the straight translation, instead of saying bring your ID, it'll tell me to bring my leg every time.
Okay.
So that's always a bit of a challenge. So you can't rely on that. And you're right, a lot of it in Southern Europe, it's about having that coffee before.
Exactly.
Reading people's body languages, and you're right. I catch myself talking much slower when I'm in that part of the world than even the Nordics or even the US. I talk very fast in the US. So you definitely have to, as I say, read the room and know who you're working with every time. And before you get there, you need to do your research.
Yeah, and also hierarchy, I think, in these countries. So if you live in the Netherlands or the Nordics, the hierarchy seems to be very approachable. Management is seen as quite similar. And if you come to Southern European countries, I think there's a lot more hierarchy. So people don't tend to speak up as much if their management is in the room as well. Or so you have to, this is very hard digitally, but you have to sense this also, actually.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a really good one. You're right. In the Nordics, it's very flat and approachable and things like that. It's very different there.
And I found that also, especially dealing also with the Asian markets. There you have Singapore, Hong Kong, which have a very Western approach to business. But you also have countries like Japan and Korea that have their own culture, their own language, where people don't really tend to say no, where you cannot make people lose face in a group. So that brings a whole new dimension of, if there is an issue or a problem and you ask people directly what happened and what did people do, you'll never get an answer on it, because it means somebody will have done something that's not right and they don't want to show. So, and it's in our nature to try to find out the root of a problem, for example, but this doesn't really work in these countries because you never get to it.
Yeah,
So you get all the information around it, but you don't get to the point. So you have to accept this in a certain way or adapt the questions you ask also to make sure people don't lose faith and they don't have to be so explicit about what happened, and just work on solving it. Although that might seem a lot more difficult if you don't know exactly the whole root cause or what happened.
right.
And to work on this as well. And I found also that often the BDM team works, of course, together with partners and sees them a lot, but it's important also that more people internally understand customers and understand the cultural aspects and why people do things the way they do or why they ask things the way they do, to create that part of understanding also.
That's a very good point. It's even more complicated to do business in Asia than it is for Westerners than it is for unlike Americans coming to Europe. It's very difficult, and if you don't understand it, you shouldn't be doing business there because you get one shot at it.
Yeah.
Because if you offend someone, then you can't go back in.
Yeah, so that's very important to realize. So I think also sometimes in that respect, we're, of course, as a business developers, always very eager to do business and very driven, but sometimes we have to hold back a bit to understand first and then take your second shot and target it right within their context. And also in the Asian market, to build the relationship first and to wait, the business will come after. Once you don't have this relationship, you can't do this. So you have to wait and be patient a little bit. And I remember also there in China, for example, that you have a lot of dinners and you think, when are we going to talk about business? Because we've been sitting here 2 hours, 3 hours, and dessert is nearly coming. And when are we going to talk? But you just have to leave this happen because business happens after that. So sometimes you have to leave your eagerness behind a little bit because you understand, okay, you have to do this relationship building first. If that's good groundwork, then you can work on the rest. And you won't be so easily exchanged, or competitors don't have so much easily a chance because you've built this relationship already. So it's an investment.
Those are all excellent points. It's all about listening and paying attention. And like I said, don't speak until you're prepared for it and know what you're talking about. And it's about the partner relationship. If people don't trust you, they're not going to do business with you.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's sometimes good quality products are very important, features are important, but I think people make a very important part of the business.
Exactly.
And people do business with people. So that's, I think, key one. And then it has to be backed up by reliable products that have a strong reputation and have added value.
Absolutely. Any other input, lessons learned, challenges or cultures you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I've been dealing with the Pacific as well, who on the contrast, then again, is very straightforward. So I think it's if you do business in multiple regions, is also adapting to that region. But first checking how is the hierarchy organized, how are organizations organized, how is the setup within the company, because within companies you also have different hierarchies. Sometimes you have very Western oriented organizations who have a very modern approach, although they're in a country where it's very formal, for example. So it depends on the organization sometimes as well. And also look at local regulations, of course. What is and how does the company you deal with these local regulations? I found in the past some companies can be very creative on just saving import duties, for example, and it can bring you into all sort of difficult issues because they fully disassemble your product, for example, because assembled products in that country are less import regulations. And you find this out at customs, who rings you and said there's some components here. So sometimes it's difficult to understand what they're doing, and perhaps could be tackled in advance. If you know what key problems are they're facing, maybe you can help them so they don't have to go through so much difficulties. But I also found that partners sometimes are locally very, very creative. And I think as an organization based in Europe, you have to also stay in touch with what you can do and be clear about that also to local partners.
That's an excellent point, because importing products into some countries, the import tax alone makes it, uncompetitive. So you're right. There's a lot of companies, a lot of countries that you get creative with how you bring product in, or even look at how can we manufacture the product there. And would that make more sense? Because importing products like into Brazil, for an example, at that point, it's almost impossible to do business with any local competition at all.
And it's also to be clear about that to partners. So sometimes I think, especially doing business with international cultures, things get lost of not explicitly sometimes saying it. And explicitly doesn't always mean very direct, but it means just being clear on what you can and cannot do and what responsibility lies with the partner or not. So then that you don't get into awkward situations afterwards also, perhaps.
That's excellent advice for anyone thinking about doing business and outside of their own country. I mean, the same thing could happen even within Europe, especially now that Brexit is about to happen.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was very insightful, and stay well.
You too. Thanks very much.